Support for the Capital Connection comes from
United University Professions, representing 37,000 academic and professional employees at SUNY campuses and teaching hospitals across New York State. Frederick E. Cole, President, uupinfo.org.
It's the Capital Connection. Hi, I'm David Gustina. Joining us this week is a new guest, Amanda Babine. She's the Executive Director of Equality New York, EQNY. It's a statewide advocacy organization working to advance equality and justice for LGBTQI New Yorkers and their families. You can find out more at equalityny.org. Amanda Babine joined Equality New York after being the Director of Policy and Programs at the New York Transgender Advocacy Group. That's NYTAG for short. Prior to her role at NYTAG, Amanda Babine worked as the Director of Evaluate for Change, a small firm that trains organizations, foundations, and governmental social programs to use data and evaluation in their practice. Amanda has a master's in social work and public policy from Columbia University. She lives in New York City, and we welcome Amanda Babine, Executive Director of Equality New York, for the first time to the Capital Connection. Great to have you with us.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me, David.
Now, I wondered if you might, being a first-time guest, give us a little bit more about yourself. Other than what I've mentioned in your bio, how do you arrive at this executive director position dealing with LGBTQI issues with Equality New York?
Absolutely. So, as you mentioned, I have a background in social work. So I originally was working years ago, more, working directly with clients. And I found that a lot of the policies, or the lack thereof policies, or obviously negative policies, were really impacting clients. And I thought, what's happening here? This seems like a bigger issue. How am I really able to work effectively to help young people? Particularly, I was working with young people who were aging out of foster care, when a lot of these policies were really negatively affecting a lot of the clients. So I thought, how do we change that? And then I got into policy. I thought about, public policy. I took my first class in undergrad, and I thought, this seems to be a really more larger macro level issue. And so I joined and thought about doing that. I made my way to working with the LGBTQ community. I am, queer myself. So I was directly impacted by a lot of these negative bills and legislation that we'll talk about in a bit. But, I thought, why don't I use some of my own personal experiences to really help others? And that's kind of what made me, gravitate towards this work. But I will say, there's also a lot of intersectionality, around, I'm also a woman, I also, come from a low income background. So, I think one of the things that people don't realize is that even if you are LGBTQ, which for those who don't know what that means, so the L stands for lesbian, the G stands for gay, the B stands for bisexual, the T stands for transgender, the Q, queer, and then we do have I, which is intersex. Two-spirit is also often added into that, and A for asexual. So, I think it's really important that we kind of have a definition there as we're moving forward. But, again, there's a lot of intersectional issues, even if, you are LGBTQ. You're also, there's lots of policies that are also negatively affecting us. So it was helpful to, jump into a role where I could work on lots of things like the ERA, which is, looking at race, sexual orientation, gender identity, all of that.
So, what was your, if you don't mind me asking, coming out experience like? We hear so much about the difficulty because of our society, and many who are listening to this program are older in age, many, and come from a different generation where, as we still grapple with people's sexual identity, for many, from the prejudiced and those
Yeah.
who are merely ignorant and maybe fearful and don't understand. We hear so many stories that are harmful for people trying to come out, even within their own families. What was yours like?
That's a great question. And I think to your point, I would say that I want to believe that most people are more ignorant than hateful, right? When people are coming out or they're interacting with, an LGBTQ person, a lot of it is this lack of knowledge. So for me, I had a very interesting coming out. I spent majority of my time in my teens and I guess preteens in foster care. So when I came out, I was, particularly reliant on the system. That is not always great. You being in foster homes, you never know, if that individual is going to be open, if they are going to be someone who's not accepting. So I would say that it was a little bit rocky. There was a lot of things that happened where it really was dependent on the space that I was in, the people, that were around me. I came out, I'm 36, I came out, as a teen, so it's been a while. I think now it's really interesting. There's far more acceptance. I believe across the board, we've just seen a huge kind of shift culturally. And so I will say, I don't think that I had a terrible experience, but it was really dependent, again, on individuals. And I think that's also why, for me, it's really important that at Aquai New York, a lot of what I do is education. We do a lot of cultural competency trainings, both for organizations and individuals, really to get them to understand, what does it mean to be LGBTQ? And I think that that's something that, is really important in this work. It's, not just passing these huge policies, but really meeting people, where they're at, answering their questions and really getting an idea of, where are they and how do we get them to understand a little bit more so they're less, ignorant on the issue and they can feel more comfortable interacting with the community.
Yeah, and I think most people understand the idea that you have a name, and some people have nicknames or they have names they want to go by. I prefer you call me this. I like David as opposed to Dave, for example. But
Mm-hmm.
then there's this issue right now with many folks not understanding, well, why are all these pronouns now? He, she, they, we, their. Can you help us with that?
Absolutely. Again, a lot of this stuff is a generational thing, and I think a big piece of this is I will always start by saying, especially non-binary people have been around forever. Now, the visibility has been different. And pronouns really, if you think about it, we always use an example of if, you find a wallet on the ground and you don't know whose wallet it is, right? Maybe their ID is missing. You would use they to describe it, right? You would say, oh, I found this, this wallet. I need to, I don't know who this is. I need to find them. You would use that language, right? So a lot of people get a little confused around it being plural. But really, it's, important for us to really respect people around their pronouns. It is, so important to so many people to be, validated and seen for who they actually are. And there have been many studies, some of my Glisten, which is a LGBTQ youth organization, that really show the impact of using the correct pronouns and names of people. And, a lot of young people have, shared that it is in some ways life-saving. The amount of young LGBTQ people who have attempted suicide is very, very high. And a lot of that has to do with, being accepted, feeling respected, and all of that. And so there are little ways that we can really make sure that we're protecting, and this goes for adults too, of course, but protecting the community and using someone's pronouns, is so, it's one of the basic things we hope people are kind of starting to understand. The same way you use that example of David, versus Dave versus, whatever it is. We really want people to realize this is a big piece of someone's identity. So we really should be respecting it. And the last piece on that I'll say is people get very nervous about using the wrong pronouns. What you want to remember is majority of people, as long as you don't have, malintent, if you're not out here, actually using the wrong pronouns, on purpose, people are very, resilient. They're not going to be like, oh my God, you're transphobic or, all of these things. They're going to see that you're trying and they're going to be, patient and also be happy that you're respecting them. So, just move forward, don't think too much about it. And really, it goes a long way to put in the effort, for people to see that you're trying to respect who they are.
Yeah, you bring in that positive vibe with the idea that there's a generational shift. We certainly see this. I just look at my nieces and nephews, and I know they don't have the same hang-ups that even our generation and the older generation has had, and still, in many cases, has. Now, let's take this to the realm of politics, and increasingly what seems to be a political institution, the Supreme Court. We have a couple of cases. Now, you mentioned intersectional, being, for example, you're a female, but you're also queer. Well, the first thing we had happen was Roe v. Wade goes down. Next thing you see is the Supreme Court at the end of June ruling that businesses have a right to refuse service in a case that centered around whether a website designer would have to make one for a gay couple. Of course, that turned out not to exist, but this idea that on one level, there's a generational shift in the American population to have more acceptance towards the LGBTQI community. And yet still in the halls of the Supreme Court right now, we have a conservative movement, which is what many would call pushing these rights backwards.
Absolutely. And, one of the big pieces here in the Supreme Court is there's a disconnect from what the culture is, right? Like you just shared it. I also have some amazing nieces. One of my nieces came out as queer when she was 11. And I remember being like, oh my God, I could never, with the generational stuff. So there's this huge change, and she was telling me she has a non-binary friend, she has a trans friend, she has a lesbian friend, she has some straight friends too, but everyone really talks about kind of, who they are. And it's not really as, taboo as it used to be, right? Or, the level of, discomfort within your own community, right? So let's talk about middle school, is very different. However, this disconnect with the Supreme Court is that that's not the same. They're not seeing that. Right? We have a very conservative, obviously an older aging group who are making these decisions. And so that disconnect makes it really hard when, we're seeing, on the ground more acceptance, but then in our policies, we're seeing a lot of, negative things come out of the Supreme Court. And I heard you start to say transgender before you said LGBTQ, which I think is spot on around that. Is a lot of these bills, of course, are across the board LGBTQ, but majority of people are attacking transgender individuals. And I want to make that very clear. That is an issue that, majority of these bills are focused on, whether it's in sports, whether it's in gender-affirming care. They are attacking transgender people, and it has been a very conservative note and movement over, obviously for a very long time, but particularly the last few years. We've seen a rise in, a lot of these anti-trans bills. And so, a lot of, what we're doing here is trying to figure out, what can the states do? What can we do as we're working towards, doing things on a larger level. I mean, many of you might know too, is we're still fighting for the Quality Act, which is in D.C. It's a national bill. That would it's very simple that people will not be discriminated, based on their sexual orientation or gender identity in employment and housing, all of these areas that touch our lives, right? And so with the Supreme Court, we're seeing all of these rulings just roll it back. And I'm glad you mentioned, and I think a lot of people have heard, the website case, there was never even a gay couple, right? And the fact that, the lack of fact checking, but also, the idea and people being emboldened to make up stories and be pushed to even have a case at the Supreme Court is absolutely wild. When there's nothing there, right? There's no validity and no, it didn't happen. It didn't happen. However, it still was something that helped, the right and the conservatives put together a really terrible, ruling, which we're really upset about.
Certainly, and yet we're in New York State, which by all accounts is a much more liberal, progressive blue state, and you've had some wins here. Why don't we talk a little about them? We have at least three, right? The Equal Rights Amendment,
Yes.
making New York a safe haven for transgender youth and families, and a long-term care Bill of Rights. Tell us about each of these.
Absolutely. So the ERA, you might have heard this also on the national level. It's being pushed. Here in the state, this would really expand the classification of what's covered around, discrimination and the need to get people based on their sex, sexual orientation, gender identity, expression, ethnicity, age, and disability, just more protections. So it is going to be on the ballot, which is really important for everyone to remember.
It includes pregnancy. Pardon me,
correct,
Amanda.
yes.
Includes pregnancy, right?
Correct. Also pregnancy. So we've seen that a lot, right, where, people can be fired for being pregnant or, things like that, or when they're looking for housing, all types of things. Yes, definitely pregnancy. So it's all these areas in which, we're just creating additional protection since we already know, based on some of the Supreme Court cases, we don't know where things are going to go, right? And so that's really important. One of the big pushes that's timely was making New York a safe haven for transgender youth and families. So as I talked about before, there's so much national, but also state anti-trans bills where, one of the more famous ones was the one in Texas where, they originally pitched this idea where, if you gave your kid gender-affirming care, you could lose your child to the child welfare system because it was neglectful. So in New York, we want to say people can come here and they cannot be prosecuted by their home state. And we passed that within 1 year, which I think says a lot about New York and what our priorities are. And I think that's really important. So now people, we actually have a bunch of people reaching out to us at Apply New York saying, oh, I'm moving from Florida or I'm moving from Montana, like all these states that are having these negative bills. The other thing I do want to say, when people hear gender affirming care, they often get a little, fixated on what that means as far as, major surgeries and things like this. A lot of times when we're talking about gender affirming care, it really is dependent on the individual, right? It could be hormonal.
Right.
So it's really important to remember that because people hear, oh, transgender youth are getting, all of these surgeries. And that's not the case usually. It's actually really hard to get a lot of these gender affirming care surgeries and things that are, very affirming for the community. But it's really hard to get a lot of those. So, I do want people to think about that and remember when we're kind of, talking about this. And then lastly is a long-term care Bill of Rights, which was amending public health law particularly in establishing LGBTQ long-term facility residence bill of rights. So right now there's especially with the aging, you think about, we often leave out aging people as individuals of the LGBTQ community that are very much, at risk, right? We think about youth a lot, but we talk about people who are in these long-term care facilities. You have to rely on the nurses and the aides to take care of you, right? And we've heard horror stories of people who are homophobic or transphobic not really taking care of people correctly because of their bias. And so this is to really try to put together, a Bill of Rights that is making sure that we are looking into our elders and they are getting, everything that they need. And it's not based on someone's thoughts about their life. Everyone should be, treated with dignity. And that includes people who are in long-term care facilities.
And their partners who want to be with them.
Exactly. And that's the thing. We've heard these terrible, terrible examples of, people who don't let their partners come because they're worried that someone's going to then judge them and know. Some people don't even come out when they're in these facilities because they're worried about how they'll be treated in discrimination. So they might not even come out, right? Or again, they might not want their partners to come because they don't want to be outed because they could be treated differently and they have very little power in these facilities. Absolutely.
I just watched the George Michael documentary where he himself said he created a whole persona because he was afraid of coming out as gay. And that's how he developed the George Michael persona. So sexual identity and gender identity has a huge impact on people and their lives and their trajectory of their lives. We've got to move quickly because we're down to the last 5 minutes. We're speaking with Amanda Babine. She is the executive director of Equality New York. It's at equalityny.org. Now, you have some priorities going forward in 2024. You want to promote comprehensive sex ed in schools. I can't imagine that's going to be easy with what we've seen going on with school boards and just teaching history of the country. And then you have the Gender Identity, Respect, Dignity, and Safety Act. And yeah, we haven't really talked about, the pushback that you're going to get, but here comes big pushback, I'd imagine, when you're talking about schools, not only because parents and sexual education is a big deal in general, but, when you throw in religion to the mix, then people start quoting the Bible against you.
Yeah, 1,000%. Absolutely. And this bill has been, there's so much coalition work. We're working with lots of organizations on this. Nightclub, our state, we're even working with, larger organizations, right? We have all the Planned Parenthoods, of New York on this. We have a really large group, but you're right, especially with the religion piece, especially with parents, getting comprehensive sex ed has been really difficult. A lot of pushback. One of the things that I always like to share, again, is very similar to what I was talking about with gender affirming care. When we talk about sex ed, people go right away, oh, we're teaching people sex, in second grade. What is sex? No. It is very age appropriate, right? So we start off talking about things just like consent. What is consent? Do you want to hug? Do you not want to hug, right? What does that look like? All these things about, our bodies and how they work, right? Really helps us destigmatize, and particularly with LGBTQ people, right? And so, yeah, it has been really difficult. We're meeting monthly. We're trying to push it through. We have a few champions that we're hoping are going to be doing some work, but we're starting a brand new campaign this year to try to push that through. And then, with the Gender Identity, Respect, Dignity, and Safety Act, which is a mouthful, I know, GERDS for short, is really making sure that trans people are in the right facilities when they're in prisons and jails. So in 2019, we passed GENDA, the Gender Expression Non-Discrimination Act, which took years to pass, about 18 years, to include trans people in anti-discriminations here in the state. They passed it for sexual orientation years before, but they left trans people out. And so we finally got that passed. However, there was a bit of a loophole in that where jails and prisons were not included. So legally in New York State, based on your sexual orientation or gender identity, again, this is all on policy. This is not personal experience. But, you cannot be discriminated when you're looking for employment, housing, even credit at banks, things like that. But again, jails and prisons were not. And so imagine being, a transgender woman who's put in a male facility when they're in a jail or prison. Frightening and inappropriate. So we're really trying to make sure that we're changing that. And of course, we're working with a lot of people who don't also want that, based on a lot of our conversations already, on people's thoughts about trans people and what's appropriate and what's not.
You've been listening to Amanda Babine, Executive Director of Equality New York. You can find out more at equalityny.org. I assume that's a place to go to also find resources. I mean, there's certainly somebody out there right now who is suffering, who hasn't come out, who maybe has been kicked out, ostracized from their family, and is looking for help. Where do they go?
Absolutely. They should come directly to us. We have over 150 coalition partners. We get multiple emails a day with people with different needs, right? It could be someone who is an asylum seeker. It could be someone who was kicked out, and they're a teen and they're looking for support. We make sure that we connect people. And then what we do particularly is, we focus on also doing advocacy on the personal level. How do you advocate for yourself, right? And that's, people forget that, that's huge. And so we do a lot of trainings and we, really work with people, to find ways to advocate for themselves, whether it's looking for employment or housing, lots of different things. So, we have all of those resources for people. And if they want to email us, they can email us very easy, general@equalityny.org. That will go directly to one of our staff members, and you'll be connected.
We are out of time. Our guest has been Amanda Babine, Executive Director of Equality New York, EQNY for short. It's a statewide advocacy organization working to advance equality and justice for LGBTQI New Yorkers and their families. You can find out more at www.equalityny.org. Amanda, I can't thank you enough for joining us, and I hope we can continue our conversation in the future.
I would love that. Thank you so much, David.